The first boom didn't sound real. It was like the sky cracked open for a second, and then everything caught fire. Luke Harper was already moving before people started screaming. One second he was climbing out of his pickup on the overpass. The next he was sprinting toward a jackknifed tanker truck, spewing flame and black smoke across the freeway. Cars sat at crazy angles, horns blaring, somebody yelling to stay back. Right at the edge of the burning mess, a state trooper's cruiser lay on its side, windshield spider-webbed engine compartment hissing. "Stay, Rusty," Luke barked, but the brown mutt stayed glued to his heel anyway, hackles up, eyes locked on the wreck. He could see the trooper inside the upside-down car, half hanging from the seatbelt, motionless. Fire rolled along the tanker's side like a living thing inching closer to the cruiser. Heat slapped Luke in the face, drying his eyes, filling his nose with the stink of fuel and melting plastic. Somebody behind him shouted that it was going to blow. Another voice begged him to get back. Luke dropped to his knees, slid on burned rubber and broken glass, and drove his shoulder into the crushed doorframe. Metal groaned. Flames popped. Rusty lunged forward and planted himself between Luke and the panicked crowd, barking like he'd take on the fire himself if he had to. For a heartbeat, the whole world was just that door that trapped Officer and the roar of fire that was about to take them all. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight and hit that like and subscribe button if you believe courage still matters in this world. Because none of that started with an explosion on I-90. It started with a man who thought his dangerous days were behind him. Luke Harper was 37, and most mornings in Cleveland, he smelled like diesel and cold coffee by 7 a.m. He worked in a concrete block garage behind the city bus depot, the kind of place nobody notices unless their bus breaks down in January. His coveralls were usually stained, his knuckles raw, his back sore by noon. But the paycheck cleared, the health insurance worked, and it kept a roof over his daughter's head. Mia was 8, going on 18, dark hair, in a messy ponytail, chipped nail polish, and a backpack covered in marker doodles. She lived for science experiments, school talent shows, and whatever stray animal she could convince Luke to foster. Rusty was one of those fosters that never left a scrappy shelter dog with one torn ear and the patience of a saint. 3 years earlier, a drunk driver had crossed the center line on a wet night and taken Luke's wife Emily in less than 5 seconds. Luke, who'd spent his 20s in combat zones as an army medic patching up men under fire, couldn't do a single thing to save the woman he loved on a quiet Ohio highway. That failure lived in his chest like a stone. People knew him now as the quiet mechanic who kept the buses running and never talked much about before. They didn't see the badges in the back of his closet, the folded uniform, the flashbacks that woke him up at 3 a.m. They saw a blue-collar single dad who left work right on time to make school pickup and who sat in the front row at every parent-teacher conference. He tried to live small, fix the brakes, pack Mia's lunches, walk Rusty after dinner, pay the bills on time, stay out of trouble in a city where sirens were just part of the background noise. But on a gray Saturday, with lake wind cutting through his jacket, Luke loaded Mia and Rusty into the truck for a simple errand: drop off an old transmission at a scrapyard on the east side, then grab hot chocolate on the way home. Traffic slowed near the bridge taillights, stacking up in long red lines. A patrol car shot past on the shoulder siren off, but lights spinning, and something about the way it swerved made Luke's stomach tighten. Up ahead, just as he crept onto the overpass, he saw it a tanker drifting sideways across 3 lanes, smoke starting to curl from underneath the patrol car, braking hard, nowhere to go. Luke's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He knew in that instant that the quiet life he'd built was about to collide with everything he'd tried to leave behind. Smoke still hung over the highway hours after the explosion, drifting like a bruised veil over the city skyline. The fire crews had packed up, the tanker had been hauled away in chunks, and the patrol car, what was left of it, was winched upright and towed off under a tarp. But the echo of that moment clung to Luke like static. He could still feel the heat on his face, still hear the groan of metal giving under his shoulder, still see the trooper's unfocused eyes staring past him as he dragged her across twisted asphalt. By sundown, he had given a statement to 3 different sets of uniforms. 2 had thanked him, 1 had barely looked at him, and all of them to some degree had treated him like a man who had wandered into something he had no business being part of. But he didn't expect what came next. On Monday morning, the director of transit maintenance, Harold Boone, a man built like a filing cabinet and with twice the warmth, was waiting beside Luke's tool chest when he walked in. Boone's suit was rumpled, his tie crooked, but his expression was pinched in a way Luke had never seen before. "Got a call from the Highway Safety Review Board," Boone said without preamble, "and from the State Patrol Internal Oversight Division." Luke set down his thermos. "About the crash," Boone grunted. "About you. And about Rusty." Rusty stretched across the concrete floor like a tired doormat, lifted one ear. Luke felt a slow drop in his stomach. "What about him?" Boone handed over a printed email, creased and smudged. "They're asking why you brought an unauthorized animal into an active accident zone. They're questioning whether you interfered with emergency operations." Luke blinked. The words didn't make sense. "I didn't bring him anywhere. He jumped out when I did, and no one was helping that trooper." Flames were... Boone held up a hand, weary. "I know. Anyone with half a brain knows. But someone higher up is looking to make this complicated. Maybe liability concerns, maybe politics, maybe they don't like civilians being the headline instead of their own." Luke's throat tightened. "The trooper, she's alive, right? Have they said no official word? Off the record, she's stable. That much I heard." He let out a breath that shook a little. Boone hesitated. "There's more. They want you to take an unpaid leave until the inquiry clears." "Unpaid?" Luke said, voice flat. "You weren't on city time," Boone said gently. "Different rules apply. And with this kind of investigation, they want distance between you and the department." Luke stared at the floor, the paycheck he depended on. Rent due in 10 days. Mia's dental bill, groceries, gas, everything. "I can't take unpaid leave," he finally said. "I can barely stay afloat as it is." Boone exhaled through his nose. "I've appealed it. If it were up to me, you'd get a medal, but they're pushing back hard." Luke nodded once, stiff and quiet. He picked up his wrench set, even though his hands felt numb. That was strike 1. Strike 2 came later that afternoon when he picked Mia up from school. Usually she ran to him, dropping her backpack halfway across the lawn and throwing her arms around his waist with her usual breathless report of the day. But this time she walked slowly, her shoulders small under her puffy jacket, her eyes shiny. "What happened?" Luke asked, kneeling to her level. She sniffed, staring at her shoes. "Some kids were saying you were on the news. They said you got in trouble, that you hurt somebody." Luke felt something old and familiar crack inside him, the same helpless fracture from the night Emily died, when he couldn't protect Mia from the truth. "I didn't hurt anyone," he said softly. "I know that," she whispered. "But the kids said their parents said that you shouldn't have been there, that you messed things up." Her voice trembled. "Are you going to jail?" Luke closed his eyes for a beat, inhaling the cold air until it steadied him. "No, sweetheart. I helped someone. That's all I did. Sometimes grown-ups don't understand things right away. She pressed her face into his neck. I don't want them saying bad things about you. I can handle it, he murmured. You let me worry about that. But he felt the sting anyway. Misunderstanding he could swallow. Accusations harder. Watching them spill onto his daughter, almost unbearable. Strike 3 came on Wednesday. A woman in a blazer and state-issued badge knocked on his apartment door at 6:45 p.m. She introduced herself as Elaine Godfrey from the Office of Civilian Oversight. Rusty growled low as she stepped inside. We're conducting a follow-up regarding your involvement in the highway incident, she said, flipping open a tablet. We also need to assess home conditions since a minor was present during a potentially reckless act. Luke pulled Mia closer instinctively. My daughter wasn't anywhere near the danger. I secured her before I moved. Godfrey didn't look up. Protocol requires verification. And your file notes a background in combat medical service. Individuals with PTSD indicators are flagged for additional review. He stiffened. Who flagged me? That's confidential. Rusty padded forward, sitting between Mia and the stranger, his tail still but alert. Godfrey eyed the dog with a frown. Is that animal trained for protection? He's family, Luke said tightly. The questioning dragged on, probing his decision-making, the accuracy of his statement, whether he had exposed a minor to emotional distress. Every phrase felt dipped in suspicion. By the time she finally left the apartment, felt colder. Mia crawled onto Luke's lap. Did we do something wrong? No, he said, forcing calm into his voice even as his pulse hammered. No baby. We did the right thing. But why is everyone mad? Luke didn't know how to answer that. He only kissed the top of her head and held her until her breathing slowed. The next day, work turned hostile. Two mechanics he barely knew, Eddie and Torres, were whispering near the tool lockers. Luke caught his name and the word cowboy, then show-off, then liability. When he reached for his torque wrench, their conversation cut off abruptly. Later, Eddie said loudly enough for the bay to hear, some folks jump into situations just to feel important. Then we're the ones picking up the pieces. Torres chuckled. If I wanted drama, I'd watch cable news. Luke said nothing. He just kept tightening bolts and checking brake lines with the same steady hands he'd always had. But he felt their eyes on his back like heat. Even Boone seemed stretched thin, avoiding Luke's gaze in meetings, sighing heavily over paperwork that never used to trouble him. The final blow came on Friday, when a letter arrived by certified mail. Mia handed it to him at the kitchen table. Dad, is this important? He already knew it was. He signed for it, opened the envelope and pulled out 2 sheets, one from the State Patrol, one from the city. The first informed him that he was officially under review for interference with emergency response procedures. The second notified him that Rusty was to be evaluated as a potentially unsafe animal since he had been present during a hazardous event and exhibited protective behavior that may pose risk in public settings. Luke reread that line twice numb. Rusty gentle. Rusty, who slept at Mia's feet every night and tolerated her brushing his fur into wild mohawks, now deemed a threat because he'd barked at a fire scene. When he looked up, Mia was watching him with wide, wet eyes. Are they going to take Rusty away? Luke forced his jaw to unclench. No, they're not taking him. But he didn't know if that was true. And that terrified him more than anything else. He reached for Mia's hand. Hers was small, trembling. She was trying so hard to be brave, trying to keep her chin up the way she'd seen him do 1,000 times. But this was too much for a child to shoulder. Dad, she whispered, why do they all think you did something wrong? You saved that lady." He swallowed hard, because sometimes doing the right thing makes the wrong people uncomfortable. She pressed her face into his chest. Rusty nudged her shoulder, whining softly. That night after Mia slept, Luke sat alone at the table, staring at the letters under the dim kitchen light. Rusty lay nearby, chin on his paws, watching him. Luke rubbed his hands over his face. He felt the old weight, the combat guilt, the loss of Emily, the countless moments when life had demanded more of him than he had left to give. This was different, though. This wasn't about danger. This was about being punished for stepping up when no one else did. He couldn't lose his job. He couldn't lose Rusty. He couldn't let Mia live in fear because adults in suits wanted someone to blame. Something had to give. The breaking point came the next morning when he opened the newspaper outside the corner store. A short article tucked between human interest blurbs and weather updates featured the crash. But the line that stopped him cold was the final paragraph: "Questions remain as to whether civilian interference complicated rescue efforts. Officials declined to comment on whether charges will be considered. Civilian interference, complicated rescue efforts, charges." Rusty's leash slipped from Luke's fingers. He stared at the words until they blurred. Across the street, a police SUV rolled slowly past the driver, glancing his way longer than felt accidental. Luke's breath tightened. It was no longer just suspicion, no longer bureaucracy. Someone somewhere was building a case. And he understood with a clarity as sharp as broken glass that whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to stop with a letter. He barely slept after reading the newspaper headline. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw pieces of the crash again. Not the fire, not the metal folding like paper, but the way the trooper's hand had twitched when he reached her. That tiny instinctive movement that reminded him she was alive, that there was still something to fight for. By dawn, the city had slipped back into its winter rhythm buses, hissing past in the pre-sun gloom. Delivery trucks rattling down alleys, plows scraping early frost from asphalt. Luke dragged himself out of bed, made Mia breakfast, and packed her lunch with the same quiet habit he always had. But his hands shook more than usual. Every sound felt louder. Every glance from another parent at school drop-off felt weighted, like they'd heard something, or thought something, or were waiting for him to snap. A cluster of moms whispered near the bike racks, their voices lowering when he walked past. One of them pulled her son closer, as if Rusty walking calmly at Luke's heel was some ticking threat. Mia saw it too. Her fingers tightened in Luke's jacket sleeve. "Is it because of the article?" she whispered. Luke crouched to meet her eyes. "None of those people know what happened." "We do. That's what matters." But it didn't make the sting go away. Not for him. And definitely not for her. He dropped her off with a smile he didn't feel, watched her disappear into the school entrance, and then stared at the closed doors for a long time before turning away. He didn't know that trouble would find him before noon. It started with a call from Boone, short-clipped and worried. "Luke, I think you'd better come in." "Am I suspended now?" Luke asked, voice flat. "No, it's not that. Just get here." When he arrived at the transit yard, he found 2 sheriff's cruisers idling near the garage bay. Not patrol cars, investigators' vehicles, the kind with reinforced bumpers and tinted windows. A woman in a tan coat and gloves stood between them, talking to Boone with a practiced, unreadable expression. Rusty bristled the moment they stepped out of the truck. Boone hurried toward Luke. "This is Investigator Raleigh County Safety Division." Raleigh offered a cool nod. "Mr. Harper, I have additional questions about the highway incident." Luke crossed his arms. "You grilled me for an hour already." "This isn't about that," Hawley said. "We've received new information. Surveillance footage from a nearby overpass shows unauthorized civilian activity before the explosion. Luke blinked at her. What does that mean? Raleigh studied him. It means someone tampered with the tanker. And whoever they were, they walked past your truck minutes before the crash. Luke's heart thudded once hard. You think that was me? Raleigh didn't answer directly. We need to understand your movements. All of them. Eddie and Torres drifted out from the garage pretending to work, but clearly listening. A couple of drivers gathered near the fence. The whole transit yard went quiet. The humiliation was hot enough to taste. Rusty stood rigid by his leg hackles up, sensing the tension. Luke shook his head. You're chasing the wrong person. Raleigh lifted her chin. If that's true, then you have nothing to worry about. Boone stepped forward. He saved a trooper's life. That counts for something. Raleigh didn't look at him. Heroism does not preclude liability. Luke stared at her, and something inside him, something that had survived deployments, firefights, grief, sleepless years raising his daughter alone, cracked. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just said, I'm done answering questions without understanding why you're hunting the person who helped. Raleigh exhaled sharply, irritated. Then I'll be filing this as a refusal to cooperate. She turned on her heel and walked away, boots crunching through thin ice. Eddie muttered under his breath. Should have stayed in the truck like a normal person. Torres smirked. Some folks just can't stand not being the hero. Something cold slid down Luke's spine. He wanted to leave. Wanted to get Mia from school and sit somewhere quiet with her until the world made sense again. But the world had other plans. At 1:37 p.m., while he was working underneath a bus engine, his phone buzzed violently in the pocket of his coveralls. 3 calls in a row from unknown numbers. Then a text from the school emergency. Pick up Mia immediately. He dropped the wrench. Crawled out from under the bus so fast he scraped his back on the metal frame. Boone looked up from across the bay, startled by the sudden movement. Everything okay? No, Luke said, grabbing his jacket. I have to go. Rusty bounded after him. On the 15-minute drive to the school, his brain spun through every nightmare possibility. Fever accident. Fight. But the closer he got, the faster his pulse hammered. It wasn't just worry something felt wrong. When he pulled into the school parking lot, he saw 2 sheriff's SUVs stationed near the entrance. A small knot of parents stood outside, the same hushed whispers as earlier, only thicker now, like tension had curdled into fear. Mia sat on a bench near the office window, her hands balled in her lap. Her eyes were red. When she saw him, she ran straight into his arms. They said I had to leave class, she whispered. They said you were being investigated again. Luke folded her close. It's okay, I'm here. But an administrator, a stern man with glasses, stepped outside. Mr. Harper, he said tightly. We received a safety alert from the county. They advised us to release your daughter to you immediately due to a possible threat connected to the highway case. Luke stared. Threat to who? To you, the man said. And possibly to her. The ground seemed to tilt. Rusty pressed against his leg, sensing the shift in energy. Luke's voice came out hoarse. What kind of threat? The administrator swallowed. Someone posted footage of the tanker crash online with your face circled, comments accusing you of tampering with the tanker. Dozens of people sharing your name, your workplace, your address. Mia's hands trembled against his jacket. Luke pulled her closer. We're going home, now. He hustled her toward the truck. But as he reached the curb, Rusty suddenly stopped dead body, rigid ears pinned forward. What is it? Luke whispered. Rusty growled low, warning primal. Then a white van at the edge of the parking lot revved hard tires, squealing as it shot forward. Its back doors rattled violently, and Luke saw a figure inside raising something long metallic, something that glinted in the weak afternoon sun. A weapon. The van accelerated toward the sidewalk, where a group of students stood frozen. Luke didn't think. He didn't weigh choices or calculate risks. His body moved before his mind caught up. "Mia, run inside!" he shouted. Rusty lunged ahead like a launched spear. The van barreled closer, too fast, too close. Luke sprinted straight into its path, every instinct from the battlefield roaring back to life. He wasn't in Cleveland anymore. He wasn't a mechanic covered in grease and doubt. He was the same man who had dragged bleeding soldiers through hostile fire, who had held Emily's hand as life slipped from her, who had sworn that Mia would never lose him to cowardice or fear. He threw himself at the students first, shoving two of them clear of the curb, grabbing another by the backpack strap and yanking him off the pavement just as the van tore through where they had stood. Rusty leapt at the open sliding door, jaws clamping onto the arm of the man holding the weapon. The gun, or whatever it was, flew out of the man's hand and clattered to the pavement. The van lurched, swerved wildly, slammed into a light pole, and skidded to a halt. Luke stumbled, breath burning in his lungs. Hands scraped raw from the asphalt. The students scrambled to their feet, wide-eyed, unharmed. Mia stood near the entrance, staring at him with terror and awe, frozen in place, until a teacher pulled her inside. Parents ran toward the scene. Teachers shouted. Sirens wailed in the distance. But the world narrowed to one sharp moment when the sheriff's deputies, who had rushed from their SUVs, stopped dead in their tracks. They had expected a suspect. Instead, they saw a man who had thrown himself between their children and a speeding van. They saw the dog they'd been told was potentially unsafe, pinning a dangerous man to the ground with perfect controlled discipline. And they saw the truth they had missed for days. Rusty released his grip only when Luke called his name. Deputies swarmed the van, dragging out two men, one unconscious, the other bleeding from the arm where Rusty had struck. Investigator Raleigh arrived seconds later, breathless. She froze at the sight of the scene, children clinging to their teachers, parents, shouting, deputies cuffing two suspects, and Luke standing in the middle of it all with scraped palms, torn jacket, and a dog who never left his side. She stared at him like she had never really seen him before. One of the deputies approached. "Those men are wanted in a string of cargo thefts. We've been chasing them for months." He glanced at the children Luke had shoved to safety. "You might have just saved half this school." The words rolled past Luke like faint echoes. His eyes were on Mia, standing inside the doorway, with her arms wrapped around herself, her whole small body shaking but alive. Safe. He exhaled for the first time since the van appeared. Raleigh stepped closer, her voice unsteady for the first time. "Mr. Harper, Luke." But whatever apology or explanation she meant to offer died on her tongue as she looked at the battered van, the scattered weapon, the students who would have been mowed down. And at Luke, quiet, scraped, exhausted, but unbroken. The power dynamic had shifted in one irreversible second. Everyone now understood exactly who Luke Harper was, and exactly who he had never been. Sirens grew louder. Reporters were already racing across the lawn. Deputies were shouting into radios, but Luke didn't hear any of it. He was already walking toward Mia, Rusty at his heel, ready to hold his daughter close before the next storm hit. For a moment after the van crashed, the whole world held its breath. Even the sirens seemed to falter their wail, catching in the winter air, as if stunned by what had just unfolded on that school lawn. Parents hovered behind police tape, pale with shock, clutching their kids like they were afraid to let go. Deputies jogged in uneven lines toward the wreck, but their faces hard skeptical. Guarded only minutes earlier, now carried something entirely new. Respect, fear, and something close to disbelief. Rusty remained locked in a perfect heel beside Luke's leg chest, rising and falling, tongue flecked with foam, yet still alert enough to track every movement. The dog didn't bark, didn't strain, didn't act out, just watched, ready, controlled, disciplined. It was the kind of discipline that didn't come from a backyard or obedience class. Luke knelt beside Mia as soon as he reached her. She didn't fling herself into his arms this time. She folded, collapsing against him the moment his hands touched her shoulders. "I'm okay," she whispered, though her whole body trembled. "Dad, you pushed those kids out of the way. You could have—" "I'm here," he murmured, smoothing her hair back. "I'm here." Rusty nudged Mia's arm with his nose, releasing a small, concerned whine. She pressed her cheek against his head. Teachers peered from the doorway. Deputies gathered around the suspects. Reporters whispered into microphones, lenses honing in on Luke like he was some kind of apparition that had stepped out of a headline. Investigator Raleigh approached last. She didn't look irritated now, or impatient, or dismissive. She looked shaken. "Mr. Harper." She paused, struggling to assemble the right expression. "That was what you just did." Luke rose slowly, putting himself between Raleigh and Mia without thinking. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," she said quietly. "That's not true." She glanced toward the pinned suspect Rusty had disarmed. "Most people don't run toward danger twice in 1 week, or take down armed criminals, or restrain a trained offender's arm with that kind of precision. And most dogs don't execute a near-perfect controlled takedown unless they're experienced," Luke finished. Raleigh studied him with new eyes. "Mr. Harper, what exactly is your background?" Luke didn't answer immediately. Not out of fear, but because this was a moment he never wanted Mia to know the version of himself he had fought so hard to bury beneath long workdays and school lunches and bedtime stories. The version Emily had helped tame the version he'd sworn to keep out of their daughter's life. But the school lawn was no place for secrets anymore. He guided Mia gently toward a waiting teacher. "Stay with Mrs. Callahan for a minute. I'll be right over there." Mia didn't want to let go, but she saw something in his face, something heavy, and slowly released his hand. Rusty stayed beside her, sitting like a sentinel. Raleigh waited until Luke joined her near the edge of the lawn. "You weren't just a mechanic," she said softly. "No," Luke replied. "But I tried to be. Your file says Army Medical Unit. But what you did today..." She shook her head. "That wasn't just medical training." Luke looked away, focusing on the twisted van. "There's only so much you can put in a file." Raleigh drew a long breath. "Help me understand." He clenched his jaw, the winter wind biting at his cheeks as memories flickered sandstorms, swallowing the horizon smoke, curling above distant ridges the sharp metallic scent of night raids. He hadn't spoken about those years in a long time, not even to Boone, not even to Emily, not in full. "I wasn't just a medic," he said finally. "They trained me as a responder for downed personnel during high-threat recoveries, fast entries, defensive extraction, controlling hostile movement long enough to evacuate the wounded." Raleigh stared. "So you were..." "Someone they sent in when things went bad," Luke finished, voice quiet. "Someone who didn't stay behind the line." "And Rusty?" she asked. Luke's gaze softened. "After Emily died, Mia struggled. I wanted to get a support dog for her. But Rusty..." He exhaled. remembering the first time he held the half-grown rescue mutt at the shelter, how Rusty had leapt into his arms with something wild and brilliant in his eyes. "He came trained," Luke said. "Military. Some unit abandoned him at the shelter when his handler was transferred. They stamped him unusable and left him." Raleigh blinked. "So Rusty is a dog who spent his first years learning to protect," Luke said, "and his last 3 learning to be gentle." The words hung between them, carried away by a gust that rattled leftover ice across the pavement. Raleigh swallowed. "Why didn't you tell us any of this?" Luke rubbed his hands together, breath fogging the air. "Because people treat you differently when they know where you've been. Because they expect you to be a threat or a savior or a headline. I just wanted Mia to have a normal dad who shows up on time and packs too many juice boxes." He paused, and because talking about what I used to do reminds me of every moment I couldn't save the person who mattered most. Raleigh's expression softened the harsh lines of her professional composure, lowering into something almost human. Behind them, deputies helped kids to the sidewalk, offering blankets and reassuring words. Teachers hugged one another, their knees still weak. Parents clung to children like they were made of something breakable. And every pair of eyes that landed on Luke carried a new kind of weight. Awe, gratitude, and shame. Boone approached next, breathless from having jogged across the parking lot. He looked Luke up and down, rumpled jacket, scraped knuckles, dusted hair. "My Aunt Harper," he murmured. "You saved those kids." Luke shifted uncomfortably. "I did what I could," Boone's voice cracked. "No, you did what no one else could, and I'll be damned if I ever let them treat you like they did this week." Deputy Marshal Craig, one of the officers who had eyed him suspiciously days earlier, stepped forward next. "I misjudged you," he said simply. "I'm sorry." Another deputy approached. "Your dog's a hero," she said. "We should have known that sooner." Rusty's ears perked at the praise tail lifting slightly. Luke felt a strange tightness in his chest. Not pride, not relief, but something more vulnerable. Recognition after suspicion hits deeper than people realize. But Raleigh wasn't finished. "There's something else," she said, lowering her voice. "Those men in the van weren't just random criminals. One of them is connected to a smuggling group we've been tracking for over a year. Today's attempt wasn't spontaneous." Luke frowned. "So the attack was planned. Not specifically for the school," she said, "but for someone who interfered with their operations. Someone who threw off their timeline by saving a trooper instead of letting her die unnoticed." A cold realization crawled through him. They were after me. Raleigh nodded. "We believe the crash wasn't an accident. And after you stepped in, you became a loose thread they needed cut." Luke exhaled sharply, the truth settling like iron in his lungs. "When will this end?" he muttered. "When we end it," Raleigh said. "And we can't do that without you." He turned toward her slowly. "What are you asking?" Raleigh took a deep breath. "Your actions today and at the highway prove you have tactical instincts we haven't seen from any civilian. Maybe from very few active personnel. And you're connected now whether you want to be or not." She glanced toward the wreckage. "We have a joint task operation forming to dismantle this network before someone else gets hurt. I want you on board." Luke stared at her. "I'm a mechanic. You're a man who ran toward fire. Twice. Who neutralized armed assailants, who protected children without hesitation, and who has experience that could save lives." Raleigh met his eyes. "We don't need a badge on your chest. We need your courage and your skill." A muscle worked in Luke's jaw. He looked back at Mia, still wrapped in Mrs. Callahan's arms, her small face peeking over the woman's shoulder, searching for him. His heart pulled in 2 directions. He had fought so hard to leave the dangerous world behind, but danger had followed him anyway, and now refusing to confront it wouldn't protect Mia. It might do the opposite. Raleigh followed his gaze. You wouldn't be alone. We'd offer protection for your daughter and your home. And Rusty? He'd become an official working partner. No one would threaten to take him again. Luke's breath caught, not because of the offer, but because of what it represented. A chance to stop running. A chance to stop hiding. A chance to use the very thing he'd tried to bury. To build something safer for Mia's future. The parking lot quieted. Even the wind seemed to wait. Mia took a small step toward him. Dad. Her voice pulled him out of the silence like a lifeline. He reached for her hand, Rusty pressing in close at his side. And in that moment, standing in the middle of a shaken schoolyard, surrounded by deputies who now understood him, investigators who finally believed him, and a daughter who looked at him like he hung the moon, Luke knew his next decision would shape everything that came after. He looked at Raleigh. What exactly do you need me to do? Her answer would push the story toward its final turning point, and into whatever future awaited him. For the rest of that afternoon, the school grounds felt like a place holding its breath. Deputies blocked off the lot, investigators photographed skid marks, and shaken teachers ushered students back inside with a tenderness that hadn't been there hours earlier. But the biggest shift wasn't in the crowd, it was in the way people looked at Luke. Parents who had whispered about him days ago now approached with trembling gratitude. One mother clutched his hand with both of hers, unable to speak past the tears. A teacher who once kept a wary distance hugged him so hard his ribs hurt. Even the deputies who'd eyed him with suspicion lingered nearby, as if guarding him now instead of questioning him. By the time Raleigh walked him and Mia to his truck, the tone in her voice had changed completely. Respect replaced skepticism. Care replaced cold procedure. We'll have extra patrols by your building tonight, she told him. No one's taking chances where your family is concerned. Luke nodded, though part of him still wasn't used to anyone looking out for him. Rusty wagged his tail at Raleigh like he already accepted her as part of the pack. When they got home, Boone was waiting in the parking lot, leaning awkwardly on the hood of his sedan. He straightened when Luke approached. I heard what happened. Boone hesitated, then added, I want you back at work Monday. Full pay. No leave, no suspension. I already called HR and the city attorney. Those letters you got, consider them withdrawn. Luke blinked. Just like that. No, Boone said, not just like that. You earned something that can't be put into policy language, and that makes people move a lot faster than paperwork does. He handed Luke a second envelope, this one from the union. They voted, Boone said. You're covered, fully. For the first time in days, Luke felt the pressure in his chest loosen. A small step, but big enough to breathe again. But the real change settled in that evening when Raleigh returned with 2 deputies to go over security protocols. Mia sat nearby on the couch, Rusty's head in her lap, while Raleigh walked Luke through what participation in the task operation might look like. You won't be undercover. You won't be on the front line. We're not asking you to be a soldier again, she said. But we've seen what you can do, and we need someone who thinks like you, someone who can predict danger before it hits the rest of us in the face. Luke listened quietly, and Mia Raleigh nodded. She'll have protection until this network is dealt with, and you'll have a say in every step you take. He glanced at his daughter, small, tired, brave. I left that life so she wouldn't live in its shadow. And now Raleigh said gently, stepping into the light, might be what finally protects her. The decision didn't come easy, but when he looked at Mia, safely tucked under a blanket, Rusty guarding her like the world depended on it, He understood something he hadn't allowed himself to admit. Sometimes running from your past only makes it chase harder. The next morning, he told Raleigh, yes. Weeks passed in a blur of briefings, strategy meetings, and long evenings practicing controlled drills with Rusty to refine the old instincts. Luke wasn't on raids or chases he didn't want glory, and Raleigh didn't need him in the line of fire. They needed his mind, his experience, his ability to read a dangerous scene the way others read maps. He consulted. He trained new recruits. He helped build profiles. And little by little, some of the people who had once doubted him began to seek him out, asking advice, offering thanks, even apologizing. Eddie from the garage stopped by one night. He shuffled awkwardly at Luke's door hands in pockets. "I said stupid things," he muttered. "Didn't know what kind of stuff you'd been carrying. Won't pretend to understand it, but you're a good man, always were." Luke nodded, accepting the apology without rubbing salt in it. Life was too short to keep score that way. As for Mia, she bloomed. The school held an assembly to honor the students' quick thinking and the deputy's rapid response, but the loudest applause came when the principal surprised the entire gym by calling Luke and Rusty to the stage. Mia stood proudly in the front row, cheering louder than anyone, her smile brighter than the winter sun through the high windows. By early spring, the smuggling ring behind the tanker attack was dismantled. Arrests stretched across 3 counties. A press conference praised collaborative civilian expertise, though Luke declined every interview request. He didn't want spotlights. He wanted normal mornings, safe nights, and a daughter who no longer flinched every time a siren wailed. And slowly, they got that back. A year later, Luke still worked at the transit shop, though now he consulted part-time with emergency services on response protocols. Rusty, officially recognized as a working support dog, had his own ID badge Mia insisted on laminating. They volunteered together at the youth center on Saturdays, teaching kids about safety and calm thinking under pressure. Life didn't turn perfect. It never does. But it grew steadier, warmer, safer. One crisp October evening, Luke stood at the edge of the soccer field watching Mia run drills with her team. Rusty lay beside him, tail thumping every time she glanced their way. The sun dipped low, turning the sky orange, and the cold air smelled faintly of cut grass. Raleigh approached, hands in her jacket pockets. "You know," she said, "there's a training director position opening up with the county. Civilian-led, flexible hours, good benefits. They'd be lucky to have someone with your instincts." Luke smiled a little. "You recruiting me again? Just making sure the right doors stay open," she said. "You've earned that much." He looked back at Mia, laughing with her teammates' hair tangled from the wind, whole world ahead of her. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe it's time." Raleigh nodded once and walked away, leaving him with the sunset, his daughter, and a dog who had somehow become the heartbeat of their home. Luke placed his hand on Rusty's head. "We did all right, buddy," he murmured. Rusty looked up, eyes soft, then rested his head against Luke's leg. And in the settling calm of that evening, with laughter floating across the field and the weight of the past finally easing off his shoulders, Luke realized something simple. Sometimes the greatest rescue isn't pulling someone from danger. Sometimes it's finding your way back to the kind of life worth protecting. The kind built slowly, quietly, faithfully, one brave choice at a time.